The morning mist clung to Lake Erie's surface like a shroud over the dead. And perhaps that was fitting, for before the sun reached its zenith on September the 10th, 1813, many brave souls would find their eternal rest beneath these freshwater waves. 27-year-old Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship Lawrence, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the distant sails of the British squadron emerge from the haze like ghostly harbingers of war. Perry's rise to command this makeshift American fleet had been nothing short of remarkable. Born in South Kingston, Rhode Island, he had entered naval service as a mere boy of 14, earning his commission through grit and an unwavering dedication to his country's cause. When the War of 1812 erupted, the young officer found himself assigned to the Great Lakes Theater, where control of these inland seas would determine the fate of the northwestern frontier. The stakes could not have been higher. British forces under General Isaac Brock had captured Detroit the previous year, dealing a devastating blow to American morale and leaving the entire Michigan territory under enemy control. The British fleet, commanded by Captain Robert Heriot, Berkeley held absolute dominion over Lake Erie, using it as their highway to supply distant garrisons and coordinate attacks against American positions. Without naval supremacy on the lake, any American attempt to retake Detroit would be doomed to failure. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, in late March of 1813 to find a collection of half-built ships and raw recruits who had never seen naval combat. The task before him seemed impossible: forge this motley assembly into a fighting force, capable of challenging Britain's seasoned naval veterans. Working with relentless determination, Perry supervised the completion of his fleet while drilling his men in the arts of seamanship and gunnery. His squadron consisted of 9 vessels of varying sizes and conditions. The Lawrence, named after the fallen Captain James Lawrence, whose dying words "Don't give up," the ship had become the fleet's battle cry, served as Perry's flagship. Her sister ship Niagara, commanded by Lieutenant Jesse Elliott, mounted equal firepower. The remaining vessels ranged from converted merchant ships to purpose-built gunboats, each carrying whatever armament could be procured from the naval yards of the Atlantic coast. The British fleet, by contrast, represented the pinnacle of naval excellence. Captain Barclay, a veteran of Trafalgar, who bore the scars of that great victory, commanded 6 warships that embodied centuries of British maritime tradition. His flagship Detroit, recently completed at the Amherstburg yards, mounted 19 guns and flew the ensign that had dominated the world's oceans for generations. The Queen Charlotte, under Captain Robert Finnis, provided additional heavy firepower, while the remaining vessels formed a well-balanced squadron designed for both battle and patrol duties, as referenced in the American Battlefield Trust's comprehensive analysis of the engagement. Perry's strategic position seemed precarious at best. His crews consisted largely of landsmen, soldiers borrowed from the army, and a handful of experienced sailors transferred from Atlantic stations. Many had never fired a naval gun in anger, and few understood the complex maneuvers required for ship-to-ship combat. Against them sailed the pride of the Royal Navy's Lake Erie Squadron, manned by veterans who had learned their trade in the crucible of the Napoleonic Wars. Yet Perry possessed advantages that his enemy could not match. His ships, built specifically for lake warfare, drew less water and carried heavier armament than their British counterparts. More importantly, he commanded the loyalty of men who fought not for king and empire, but for their own soil and the promise of freedom that America represented. As the 2 fleets maneuvered toward their fateful encounter, we knew that victory would require every ounce of courage, skill, luck that Providence might grant. The die was cast, and on this September morning, the fate of the Great Lakes frontier would be decided by iron and blood upon waters that had never before witnessed such Carnagnon. Broke blood-red over Lake Erie as the 2 fleets formed their battle lines, each commander knowing that only one would see sunset, still flying their colors. Captain Robert Heriot Berkeley, his uniform bearing the decorations earned in service under Nelson himself, studied the approaching American vessels through his spyglass with the calculating eye of a predator. The British line stretched across the lake's azure surface like a string of deadly pearls, each ship positioned to deliver maximum devastation when the moment came. Barclay's tactical advantage lay in his long guns, weapons that could reach out and savage the enemy while remaining beyond the range of the Americans' shorter-ranged carronades. His plan was simple and proven: maintain distance, use superior seamanship to control the engagement, and methodically destroy Perry's fleet piece by piece. The Detroit led the line with her 19 guns gleaming in the morning sun, followed by the Hunter, Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost Chippewa, and Little Belt arranged in precise formation. Perry understood his disadvantage all too well. His carronades, while devastating at close range, required him to close the distance and engage in the brutal close-quarters combat that would negate British advantages in seamanship and gunnery training. It was a gamble that would either win the lake or see his entire command sent to the bottom. Standing on the Lawrence's quarterdeck, he raised the battle flag bearing Captain Lawrence's immortal words, "Don't give up the ship." At 5 minutes before noon, the silence was shattered by the thunder of the Detroit's opening broadside. The heavy balls screamed across the water, sending up towering columns of spray as they found their marks along the Lawrence's hull. Perry's flagship shuddered under the impact, her timbers groaning in protest as splinters filled the air like deadly snow. The battle for Lake Erie had begun in earnest. The Lawrence answered immediately, her carronades roaring defiance despite their inability to reach the enemy effectively. Perry ordered his helmsman to close the distance, knowing that each moment spent under fire without the ability to respond in kind brought his ship closer to destruction. The British line maintained perfect discipline, their guns speaking in measured volleys that turned the lake's surface into a cauldron of smoke and flame. As the American fleet advanced through the hellish gauntlet, the disparity in training and experience became brutally apparent. The Caledonia, struggling to keep station, fell behind and could not bring her guns to bear effectively. The gunboats, designed for coastal defense rather than fleet action, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by their British counterparts. Most critically, the Niagara under Lieutenant Elliott seemed reluctant to close with the enemy, maintaining a distance that rendered her powerful armament largely useless. The Lawrence bore the brunt of the British fire as she closed the range, her deck becoming a charnel house as round after round crashed into her hull and superstructure. Perry moved among his men like a man possessed, encouraging the wounded, directing the guns, and refusing to yield an inch despite the mounting casualties. Blood ran in rivers across the deck, mixing with seawater and gunpowder to create a crimson paste that made footing treacherous. By 1 o'clock, the Lawrence had absorbed punishment that would have sunk a lesser vessel. Her masts hung in splinters, her hull was pierced in dozens of places, and of her original crew of 103 men, only 20 remained capable of fighting. Yet still, Perry refused to surrender, ordering his remaining guns to continue firing even as the British closed in for the kill. His personal courage inspired his surviving crew to superhuman efforts, each man determined to sell his life dearly for the cause of American independence. The tide of battle seemed irrevocably turned against the Americans when the British Detroit and Queen Charlotte, emboldened by their apparent victory, moved in closer to deliver the final blow. Captain Barclay, wounded but still commanding from his quarterdeck, was prepared to accept Perry's surrender with the magnanimity expected of a British gentleman. The Union Jack flew triumphant over waters that had never before witnessed British defeat, and it seemed that Lake Erie would remain a British lake for the duration of the war. But Oliver Hazard Perry was not yet ready to strike his colors. In a moment that would define American naval courage for generations to come, he made a decision that shocked both friend and foe, abandoning his shattered flagship. He would transfer his command to the Niagara and personally lead the fresh ship into the heart of the British line. It was an act of desperate audacity that would either seal American defeat or transform disaster into the most stunning naval victory in the young nation's history. The small boat carrying Commodore Perry across the blood-churned waters of Lake Erie seemed insignificant against the backdrop of thunder and smoke that engulfed the battlefield. British gunners, recognizing the importance of their target, concentrated their fire on the fragile craft as it made its perilous journey from the dying Lawrence to the undamaged Niagara. Cannonballs sent up geysers of water mere yards from the boat's gunwales, while grapeshot hissed overhead like a swarm of iron wasps, seeking to end American hopes with a single lucky strike. Perry stood upright in the boat's stern, his uniform torn and blackened with powder smoke, his face streaked with the blood of his fallen comrades. In his hands, he clutched the battle flag that had flown over the Lawrence throughout her desperate fight, its fabric torn by shot and shell, but still bearing the words that had become his personal creed. "Don't give up the ship." The 4 sailors manning the oars pulled with desperate strength, knowing that their commander's life, and perhaps the fate of the entire war, depended on reaching the Niagara before enemy fire could claim them all. Behind them, the Lawrence continued her death struggle, her remaining guns still spitting defiance despite the overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Yarnall, assuming command of the shattered flagship, maintained the fight with the handful of men still capable of serving the guns. The ship's surgeon, Usher Parsons, worked frantically in the blood-soaked cockpit below, tending to wounds that would have challenged the skills of surgeons in the finest hospitals of London or Boston. The screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of cannon to create a symphony of suffering that spoke to the true cost of naval warfare. The British line, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage with the methodical precision that had made them masters of the world's oceans. Captain Barclay, though severely wounded by American grapeshot that had shattered his right arm and left shoulder, refused to quit his quarterdeck. His first lieutenant, killed in the opening exchange, had been replaced by Lieutenant George Inglis, who maintained the Detroit's fire with clockwork regularity. The Queen Charlotte, under the capable command of Captain Robert Finnis, had positioned herself to rake the American line and was systematically destroying any vessel that dared to close within range. As Perry's boat approached the Niagara, could see Lieutenant Jesse Elliott pacing the quarterdeck of the fresh ship. Elliott's reluctance to close with the enemy had preserved his vessel from the carnage that had consumed the Lawrence, but it had also denied the Americans the concentrated firepower they needed to penetrate the British line. Perry's arrival would change that equation dramatically, bringing to bear the tactical genius and aggressive spirit that had marked his entire naval career. The moment Perry's feet touched the Niagara's deck, the dynamic of the entire battle shifted like the wind changing direction on a stormy sea. Elliott, recognizing his commander's presence, immediately offered to transfer to one of the smaller vessels and coordinate their attacks. Perry accepted, knowing that Elliott's seamanship skills would be invaluable in maneuvering the gunboats. For maximum effect, change of command was executed with the smooth precision of a well-drilled evolution, despite the chaos of battle raging around them as referenced in detailed accounts from the U.S. Naval Institute's historical archives. Perry's transfer to the Niagara marked the turning point of the entire engagement. His first orders were to signal the scattered American vessels to close with the enemy, using flag hoists that cut through the smoke and confusion to rally his command. The sight of their Commodore's battle flag flying from a fresh ship sent a surge of renewed hope through the American fleet, transforming what had seemed like inevitable defeat into the possibility of victory. The Niagara's crew, many of whom had watched helplessly as their comrades on other ships suffered under British fire, welcomed their commander with cheers that could be heard above the din of battle. Perry's reputation for courage and tactical skill had preceded him, and his presence on their deck transformed them from reluctant spectators into eager participants in what would become the most decisive naval engagement of the War of 1812. With the Niagara's 20 guns loaded and ready, a crew fresh and eager for battle, Perry prepared to execute the maneuver that would either crown his career with glory or see him join the countless naval officers who had found their graves beneath the waves. The British line, confident in their apparent victory, had allowed their formation to become somewhat scattered as individual captains sought to deliver the final blow to the surviving American vessels. It was precisely the opportunity that Perry had been waiting for, and as he gave the orders that would send the Niagara charging directly into the heart of the British formation, he knew that the next few minutes would determine whether American independence could be maintained on the Great Lakes or whether British supremacy would continue unchallenged until the war's end. All hands prepare for close action. Perry's voice rang across the Niagara's deck with the authority of a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink.
Boss.
The fresh crew responded with the efficiency of seasoned veterans, though most had never seen combat until this terrible day. Gun crews rammed home charges and shot with practiced motions, while Marines checked their muskets and fixed bayonets for the boarding action that seemed inevitable. The Niagara's massive 20-pound carronades, silent throughout the morning's slaughter, now trained on targets that finally lay within their devastating range, the British line. Having savaged the Lawrence and held the other American vessels at bay, found themselves caught in a moment of fatal complacency. Captain Berkeley, weakened by loss of blood from his multiple wounds, watched in growing alarm as the pristine American ship bore down on his formation with obvious hostile intent. The Detroit's crew, exhausted by hours of continuous firing, struggled to maintain their rate of fire as their captain called for maximum effort in these crucial moments. Perry's tactical masterstroke unfolded with the precision of a chess grandmaster's final gambit. Rather than engaging in the traditional line-of-battle tactics that favored the more experienced British crews, he aimed the Niagara directly at the gap between the Detroit and Queen Charlotte, intending to break through the enemy formation and rake their vessels from positions where they could not effectively respond. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing, exceptional seamanship, and the kind of raw courage that separated legendary commanders from merely competent ones. The Niagara's approach did not go unnoticed by the British commanders, who immediately recognized the mortal threat posed by this fresh American ship. The Detroit and Queen Charlotte attempted to maneuver to bring their broadsides to bear, but their rigging had been damaged by earlier exchanges, and their crews were depleted by casualties. Captain Finnis of the Queen Charlotte, realizing the danger, ordered his ship to close with the Detroit to prevent the American from breaking through their line. The collision between the two British ships occurred at the worst possible moment, their tangled rigging and fouled yards rendering both vessels virtually helpless as Perry's ship approached at full speed. The sight of Britain's finest warships locked together in helpless embrace sent a surge of exhilaration through the American crew, who recognized that fortune had finally turned in their favor. The Niagara's gun crews stood ready at their pieces, matches glowing, waiting for their commander's word to unleash devastation. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the Niagara opened fire with a broadside that shattered the afternoon air and marked the beginning of the end for British naval supremacy on Lake Erie. The 20-pound balls crashed into the entangled British ships at point-blank range, their impact magnified by the enemy's inability to maneuver or escape. The sound of rending timber mixed with the screams of wounded men as Perry's gunners demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of American gunnery when properly applied. The British response, when it came, was ragged and poorly coordinated. Detroit's remaining guns spoke gamely, but their shot mostly passed through the Niagara's rigging without causing significant damage. The Queen Charlotte, locked in her fatal embrace with the flagship, could bring only a few guns to bear, and these were quickly silenced by the Americans' overwhelming firepower. The smaller British vessels, Hunter, Lady Prevost, and the gunboats, found themselves isolated and outnumbered as the American fleet finally closed for the decisive action. Perry's breakthrough had achieved more than tactical advantage, shattered British morale, and demonstrated that American seamanship could match anything the Royal Navy could offer. The crew of the Niagara, inspired by their commander's example and encouraged by their sudden dominance, served their guns with mechanical precision that would have impressed veterans of Trafalgar. Each broadside struck home with telling effect, reducing proud British ships to floating wrecks within minutes of the engagement. The transformation of the battle was so complete and so sudden that many participants later described it as supernatural, as if divine providence had intervened on behalf of American independence. The Lawrence, though battered beyond recognition, still flew Perry's battle flag and continued to engage the enemy with her few remaining guns. Lieutenant Elliott, now commanding the smaller vessels, brought them into effective range where their lighter armament could contribute to the destruction of the British squadron. As the smoke of battle began to clear, revealing the extent of American success, Captain Barclay found himself facing the most bitter moment of his distinguished naval career. The Detroit, his proud flagship, was taking water through a dozen holes and could no longer maneuver effectively. His crew, decimated by casualties and demoralized by their sudden reversal of fortune, looked to him for orders that could only acknowledge the inevitable. The Queen Charlotte, her colors still flying but her guns silent, presented an equally grim picture of British defeat. The moment had come for decisions that would echo through naval history. As the proud Royal Navy faced the unprecedented reality of total defeat at the hands of an upstart American squadron commanded by a 27-year-old officer who refused to accept the possibility of failure, the white flag that fluttered from the Detroit's masthead seemed impossible to British eyes, accustomed to centuries of naval supremacy. Yet there it flew in the afternoon breeze, signaling the first complete surrender of a British squadron in the Royal Navy's storied history. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, his uniform stained with his own blood and that of his fallen crew, stood on his quarterdeck with the bearing of a man who had done his duty despite the overwhelming odds that fate had arrayed against him. His decision to surrender had not come easily, but with his ship sinking, his crew decimated, and his formation shattered, honor demanded that he preserve the lives of the men who had followed him into battle. The Queen Charlotte followed her flagship's example, within minutes her colors striking an acknowledgement of defeat that no amount of British seamanship could reverse. Captain Robert Finnis, mortally wounded in the final exchange, had passed command to his first lieutenant, who recognized that continued resistance would serve only to increase the casualty lists, without affecting the battle's inevitable outcome. The proud ship that had terrorized American positions around Lake Erie for months now lay helpless under the guns of the victorious Niagara. Perry, standing on his quarterdeck amid the wreckage of what had been the most savage naval engagement. Ever fought on fresh water? Watched the British colors come down with a mixture of triumph and profound relief. The young Commodore who had transferred his command under fire now found himself master of an entire British squadron. A victory so complete and unexpected that news of it would electrify the American nation and send shock waves through the Admiralty. In London, the smaller British vessels attempted a desperate escape as their larger consorts surrendered. But the American gunboats, no longer facing the concentrated firepower of the entire British line, gave chase with renewed vigor. The Hunter and Lady Prevost, damaged in the earlier fighting, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by American vessels eager to complete the victory. Only the tiny Chippewa and Little Belt managed to make their escape toward British-held territory, carrying with them the first news of this catastrophic defeat. The silence that fell over Lake Erie after hours of thunderous combat seemed unnatural. It's broken only by the groans of wounded men and the creaking of damaged ships riding uneasily on swells still disturbed by the passage of cannonballs. American sailors, many of whom had begun the day convinced they were sailing to their deaths, now found themselves victorious beyond their wildest dreams. The impossible had been accomplished through courage, determination, and the leadership of a commander who had refused to accept defeat, even when it seemed inevitable. Perry's first concern was for the wounded, both American and British, who filled the makeshift hospitals established in the ship's cockpits and on their decks. Surgeon Usher Parsons, who had performed miracles of medical skill aboard the Lawrence, now found his services required for British casualties as well. The Commodore's orders were explicit. Enemy wounded would receive the same care as American sailors. A gesture of humanity that would be remembered long after the political causes of the war had been forgotten. The capture of the entire British squadron represented more than a mere tactical victory. It was a strategic triumph that would reshape the entire character of the war in the Northwest. With British naval power on Lake Erie completely eliminated, American forces could now move freely across the lake to threaten British positions in Canada. Fort Detroit, which had fallen to the British early in the war, became untenable without naval support. And General William Henry, Harrison's army could now advance with the assurance of naval supremacy behind them. The human cost of victory had been severe, particularly aboard the Lawrence, which had borne the brunt of British fire during the morning's engagement. Of her crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate that spoke to the savage intensity of naval combat at close range. The Niagara, entering the battle fresh, had suffered minimal losses, though her crew had witnessed enough carnage to last several lifetimes. British casualties were equally severe, with both the Detroit and Queen Charlotte resembling floating charnel houses more than warships. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Perry sat down to compose the message that would carry news of his victory to a nation desperate for good news from any front. His words, written in the cabin of the captured Detroit, would become immortal in American naval history. The simple message addressed to General Harrison and destined to reach President James Madison within days consisted of only 14 words that captured the completeness of American triumph. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The Battle of Lake Erie was over, but its consequences would resonate far beyond the waters where it had been fought. Perry's victory had demonstrated that American naval officers and sailors could match the best that Britain could offer, proving that the young public possessed the resources and determination to challenge the world's greatest naval power on any waters where they might meet. The morning after the battle dawned clear and calm over Lake Erie, its placid surface giving no indication of the savage combat that had raged across these waters just hours before. The captured British fleet rode at anchor under American colors, their battle damage a stark reminder of the price paid for control of these crucial waters. Commodore Perry, having spent the night tending to wounded sailors and assessing his prizes, now faced the complex task of consolidating his victory and exploiting its strategic implications. The intelligence gathered from captured British officers revealed the full magnitude of what had been accomplished. The defeat of Barclay's squadron had not merely eliminated British naval power on Lake Erie, it had severed the vital supply line that sustained British positions throughout the Old Northwest Territory. Fort Detroit, that symbol of early American humiliation in the war, could no longer receive reinforcements or supplies by water. British garrisons scattered across Michigan, Ohio, and the Indiana Territory suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable. General William Henry Harrison, commanding the American Army of the Northwest, received Perry's famous dispatch with jubilation that quickly transformed into urgent planning for offensive operations. The naval victory had handed him the strategic initiative that had been lacking throughout the war's early phases. With control of Lake Erie secured, Harrison could now transport his army across the lake to threaten British positions in Upper Canada, forcing the enemy to fight on ground of American choosing. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond military circles throughout the United States. Newspapers trumpeted the triumph with headlines that restored American confidence after a series of military disasters. The National Intelligencer in Washington proclaimed it the most brilliant naval victory achieved by American arms, while papers from Boston to Savannah celebrated Perry as the hero who had proven American sailors could outfight the vaunted Royal Navy on equal terms. In London, news of the defeat sent shockwaves through the Admiralty and the government of Lord Liverpool. Never before in the Royal Navy's long history had an entire squadron surrendered to an enemy force. The implications were staggering. If American naval officers could defeat experienced British commanders on the Great Lakes, what did this portend for the broader war effort? Admiral Sir John Burleigh Warren, commanding North American waters, faced uncomfortable questions about how such a catastrophe could have occurred. The strategic consequences unfolded with remarkable speed. Within weeks of Perry's victory, British forces began evacuating Detroit and other exposed positions, recognizing that they could no longer be supplied or reinforced across the lake. General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in the region, found his options severely limited by the loss of naval support. His Indian allies, led by the formidable warrior Tecumseh, began questioning British promises of victory and territorial concessions. Harrison's subsequent advance into Canada, made possible by Perry's control of the lake, culminated in the Battle of the Thames on October 5, 1813. This engagement, which saw the death of Tecumseh and the destruction of the British-Indian alliance, completed the transformation of the strategic situation in the Northwest. What had begun with a naval battle on Lake Erie had cascaded into the liberation of an entire region from British control. The treatment of British prisoners captured in the battle reflected the best traditions of naval warfare and enhanced American prestige throughout Europe. Captain Berkeley, despite his wounds, received the courteous treatment accorded to a defeated but honorable enemy. Perry's magnanimity toward his prisoners, combined with his care for British wounded, demonstrated that American officers possessed the gentlemanly qualities that European powers associated with civilized warfare. Perry's victory also had profound implications for American naval development. The success achieved by a hastily assembled fleet of converted merchant vessels and purpose-built gunboats demonstrated that American shipbuilders and naval architects could produce vessels capable of matching British designs. The lessons learned on Lake Erie would influence naval construction programs throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. The economic impact of controlling Lake Erie became apparent almost immediately. American merchants could now trade freely across the lake, while British commerce found itself excluded from waters they had previously dominated. The prosperity of American settlements along the lake's shores, which had languished under British naval supremacy, began to revive as normal commercial activity. Resumed under the protection of Perry's fleet, international observers took careful note of the American victory, particularly in European capitals where the war was being watched for signs of British vulnerability. The defeat of a Royal Navy squadron by American forces suggested that Britain's naval supremacy might not be as absolute as previously believed, calculation that would influence diplomatic negotiations and military planning in other theaters of the global conflict. As autumn advanced and the campaign season drew to a close, Perry found himself the most celebrated naval officer in America, his name mentioned alongside those of Revolutionary War heroes. Yet the young Commodore remained focused on consolidating his victory and preparing for whatever challenges the next year might bring to the Great Lakes Theater. The winter of 1813-14 found Commodore Perry in Washington, D.C., where Congress and the nation showered him with honors befitting the architect of the most complete naval victory in American history. President James Madison received him at the Executive Mansion with the warmth reserved for national heroes, while Secretary of the Navy William Jones struggled to find precedents for rewarding an officer who had accomplished something no American commander had ever achieved: the capture of an entire enemy fleet. Congress voted Perry a gold medal and authorized prize money for his entire crew, recognition that transformed common sailors and Marines into wealthy men overnight. The captured British vessels, after careful evaluation by naval architects, were incorporated into the American fleet, their designs studied and their construction methods adopted for future shipbuilding programs. The Detroit and Queen Charlotte, symbols of former British supremacy, now flew the stars and stripes as permanent reminders of American naval prowess. Perry's tactical innovations during the battle became required study at the newly established Naval Academy, where future officers learned how audacious leadership and aggressive tactics could overcome apparent disadvantages in training and equipment. His decision to transfer command under fire, initially criticized by some as abandoning his post, was recognized as the masterpiece of naval leadership that had transformed certain defeat into glorious victory. The human cost of the victory was never forgotten by those who survived it. The Lawrence, so battered that she required complete reconstruction, became a shrine to American naval courage. Surgeon Usher Parsons Hash, when the American fleet outfought Britain's finest on the waters of Lake Erie.